Have you ever played The Sims? Did you feel like a god while you were playing it? It seems there's something god-like about having the power to create a world, shape lives, and control destinies at your fingertips. It doesn't matter if you're building the perfect suburban neighborhood or setting up the most ridiculous disaster-filled environment. There's probably a feeling of omnipotence in controlling little digital beings. You can shape their fate with a click, and if they annoy you, you can have some tragedy befall them. The Sims, as a game, gives you that power, but here's the twist. Have you ever paused and asked yourself, what if I were one of those Sims? Imagine for a moment that you're not the one pulling the strings. Instead, you are the Sim, and furthermore, you know it. You are the puppet, the life being directed by an invisible hand. Now, you're forced to consider a rather profound question. Is your creator, the person outside the game, a god? Hello and welcome to another episode of Noah's Snark. I'm Atheist Josephina, aka AJV, and today I want to talk about the idea of God being outside of space and time by way of this Sims analogy. First, real quick for those unfamiliar with The Sims. The Sims is a series of life simulation video games first published by Electronic Arts in 1989 that thrusts the player basically into the role of a god. It's not the only game of its kind, but it's probably the most familiar to people of a certain age. Now, when you start playing The Sims, you step into a role that most people in real life only wish they could occupy. The creator, the architect of lives. You design your Sims' personalities, their appearances, their aspirations, sometimes their entire existence. You make the decisions that will shape their worlds. From their job choices, to the people they meet, to what happens in the environment around them. You're the omnipotent force guiding them towards success or failure, happiness or despair. As far as the game's universe is concerned, you are a god, barring a proper definition of God. You can create and destroy without consequences for yourself, and their world exists only because of your attention. You decide when the Sims will eat, sleep, go to work, and pursue their dreams. The entire situation hinges on your choices. You control their lives. But what if you were the Sim? As a player of The Sims, you're accustomed to being in control. But consider what it would be like to be the subject of that control. You're a character in someone else's game, directed by rules and limits that you cannot see, understand, or alter. If you were a Sim, your thoughts would be simple and based on basic needs like hunger, social interaction, and sleep. But there's always an invisible force outside your world, a hand that makes you get up and go to work or pursue some purpose and make you interact with your fellow Sims. Who or what is that hand? The player outside your Sim universe is that hand, who would presumably be referred to as God or as a god. The relationship between the god/player and the Sims raises an interesting philosophical question. How is the Sim, meaning we, to understand this god as something that's there, something that's existent, but resides in some other space and time or metaspace in which the simulated world is but a small fraction of? One of the first problems we run into in asking this question is the player who's outside the game actually a god? As I alluded to, that depends on how one defines God, on what attributes are ascribed to this being that makes it definitionally a god. Now, this is a far from settled issue. I'm sure most Christians and possibly Muslims too subscribe to the idea of a triune God, a God that is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. Problem is, there is no universal agreement on what any of those terms mean, even if a majority of monotheists might say, in relation to omnipotence for instance, that God can do anything that is logically possible. Not even the meaning of logically possible is settled, nor do I think it could be unless we keep the definition narrow to God performing any action that does not contain a logical contradiction, such as creating a square circle or a married bachelor. But even that narrow definition is problematic if we're dealing with a player or programmers of the simulation who can change the game's rules or code to perform what appear to be supernatural violations of otherwise universal laws. I think it's important to note here, though, that whether we're dealing with the programmer of the game or the player who's assuming godlike duties and playing the game, is that neither are actually omnipotent and don't have to be omniscient or omnibenevolent. They may be, from our perspective, but are not actual triune gods. They're just regular people or unexceptional agents, perhaps flawed in the same way the Greek gods were written, but still people nonetheless, if we are in fact, me and you right now, living in a simulation, which by the way was a hypothesis devised in its modern form by philosopher Nick Bostrom in his 2003 paper titled, "Are You Living in a Computer Simulation?" I find the simulation hypothesis fascinating, if just for its explanatory power, and if we really want to get speculative about who's running the simulation we're in, if we are in one, is how does that being or agent know they're not part of a simulation? That is a rabbit hole I won't get into right now. Anyway, we might also ask, from the perspective of being one of the Sims, how can we have knowledge of this player/god to begin with? From the Sims' point of view, who might be us, the player exists in a kind of metaspace or transcendent realm. This leads us to some metaphysical questions. Is the player part of the same ontology as us as the Sim? In strictest terms of the actual game, I would say no, since the Sims are digital beings and we're biological. Or are we? What does existence mean if it includes being in a completely different dimensional or conceptual space? Are the Sims categories of existence adequate to describe something like the player? This is analogous to human philosophical efforts to define or describe a god that is not spatially located, not temporally bound, and perhaps not even material in any way us as the Sim could understand. This in mind, philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that we can't know the nomenon, the thing in itself, only the phenomenon, the thing as it appears to us. In this analogy, the player of the game is pure nomenon to the Sim, the source of effects but never an object of true perception. Given these sorts of questions, it doesn't seem likely the Sims, or we, could know the true nature of the player. Sure, there's some possibility the player could make itself somehow known to the Sims, even tell some of the Sims its attributes, but there can be no justified true belief for those attributes being factual. The Sim person can't even disqualify the idea that the player isn't lying to them about who and what they are. It's just blind faith. I could tell my Sim people, if I'm the player, I could tell my Sim people I'm all-powerful, and it would seem I am indeed more powerful than them being outside the game, but that doesn't mean I'm all-powerful, even if I can influence events of the beings in the game. Next, let's talk about free will and agency. Can a Sim person be free? If the player god is constantly intervening, directing action, or manipulating desires so as to know their ends and causing disasters or disease to influence behavior, the Sim's autonomy is questionable at best. This reflects theological questions like, if God is omniscient and omnipotent, can humans be free? Again, it depends on what are ultimately the arbitrary definitions of those words, we'd have to understand in what way does the player have knowledge of the sim world? Does the player know what every sim is doing at all times? Or does the player have to look at a given sim and in knowing how the sims and the sim world operate, know what will happen next? How much autonomy does a sim person have? Are they free all the time, which to me I would construe as random choices, except that in real life, there's good neurobiological evidence to suggest choices are not random. Are sim people free some of the time depending on when the player decides to interfere? Or are they never free because of the parameters of the game don't allow them to actually make random choices? It would seem intuitive that if the player plays the game, interferes with the program in any way, even in just creating the sim world, it would seem that free will is limited at best. This raises the question of whether the relationship between the player and their sims is a moral one. Is it moral to create or control lives for the sake of entertainment? Should the player have absolute power over their creation? In the Sims series, players have the ability to create absurd situations. For example, locking Sims in a room without doors. Such actions, while meant to be humorous, they bring up concerns about the treatment of these simulated lives, if they are simulated. What if they're actually autonomous? How does that change the player's moral relationship to them? Does it change anything at all? Theistic apologists certainly enjoy casting human beings as autonomous agents because they think this keeps people morally culpable for rejecting God or his orders, but could a player/God really expect its autonomous agents not to see the player as a monster for ordering the love of the player God? I would submit that if any of us were ordered to love another person, maybe we could fake it, but it certainly wouldn't be love, not actual love, not when there are negative consequences for withholding that love. Can any of us, if we're the player of the game, really hold the Sims accountable for rejecting the player's unknowable ways? I mean, we as the player could, but would that be the moral thing to do? As a player/God of the Sims game, I would contend that none of us are morally perfect. So, if we are analogous to a sim in the Sims game, why do so many people simply assume without question God is perfect? Being outside of the game, why would any sim who has no access to the realm of the player God and cannot assess the player God's attributes assume the sim God is perfect? It seems insane to me that people actually do this with God. Now, maybe there is a God outside of our quote-unquote game, but without an ability to experience or measure God firsthand, there's a great deal about God that are simply assumptions or presuppositions. I've said many times that, maybe it's possible a God told us they're there and they have certain attributes, but without direct access to that being, we can't know for sure this being isn't lying, however small that possibility. When we play The Sims, we basically assume the role of a god. Not omnipotent in the theological sense, but maybe omnipresent, all-seeing, with the power to shape lives, environments, and destinies. But if we contemplate ourselves as one of the Sim characters, we become an agent within a self-contained world operating according to programmed drives, responses, and routines. This vantage point allows us to raise several interesting philosophical questions, especially when we use the game as an analogy for our own relationship to reality and the possibility of a higher order being or creator. So, the next time you play The Sims or any game like it, ask yourself some basic questions if nothing else. Do you, as the player, consider yourself a god, and if so, why? And are you a morally perfect god? That's a good question to ask because if we assume the role of a sim character, And we're on the inside looking out, the player looks like a petulant child who assumes they're morally perfect, but hasn't even begun to actually examine that position. On the other hand, if you were a sim, would you consider your creator to be a god? Would you worship this being just for giving you life, even if your life is filled with pain or suffering? And importantly, why do you make assumptions about this being when you don't have direct access to them? I think this analogy between the life of a believer in God and the world of the Sims, while not perfect, and I guess no analogy is, I think it can provide us with a springboard for asking some relevant questions about what it means to be a god or one of that god's creations or subjects. Or you can continue your life never thinking about any of this and continue your existence of being an unthinking monster. Thank you for listening. For Noah's Snark, I'm Atheist Josephina. Until next time, revel in reason and love the logical.